You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I'm Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we are here once again to chat about some really interesting topic on creation. I do want to remind you here at the top of the show, go ahead and like this video or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Share our work around, leave comments, leave your love comments and your hate comments. We'll take them all. Every little bit helps us. This is a big show to produce. Takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, and we do appreciate all the support that we get from all of you listening or watching in the audience. Thank you so much. Okay, Paul. Well, we've got another installment in our Creationism 101 series. And this time we are finally moving on to a new chapter of Genesis. It only took us, I don't know, seems like 19 months or 20 months or I don't know, a long time. It took us a long time to get here. I don't know when we're going to air this, but anyway.
Yeah. It doesn't seem that long, actually.
It doesn't seem that long to you.
No, I'm kind of surprised with that, we're that far into this series and we've only got to Genesis chapter 2. But anyway, we're setting our own pace, aren't we?
We are setting our own pace, yeah. It seems like a long time to me. But yeah, at the same time, it seems like it was another fall season just like this one where I came up with the idea to do this series. So anyway, here we are. The next
here we are.
episode in Creationism 101. Paul, can you, bring us back up to speed, remind us of what we've been doing in this series and what the previous episodes have been covering and so forth?
Yeah, certainly. This has been a fun series to do, I think. What we kind of set out to do was create something that's accessible that anybody could understand. And so we sort of opened this series with an episode where we just gave an explanation of what the whole series is about, which is we wanted to put general creationist beliefs into simple language. We're not trying to break new ground. We're not trying to talk about, new discoveries. We're just trying to summarize what the average young age creationist thinks as we kind of work our way through the text of Genesis 1 to 11. So in that first episode, we sort of wanted to explain that sort of motivation for why we're doing this series, and also why we're sort of trying to integrate science and the Bible, why we're trying to put science and the Bible together. And that first episode, that actually proved to be quite a popular episode. It attracted a lot of views, also some negative feedback, I think, from people who didn't really sort of get what we were doing. People who kind of were saying to us, well, why are you taking the Bible, as trustworthy in the first place?
Right.
And of course, that's not really what the series was about. So we had sort of lots of negative feedback of that kind, but otherwise it was a really popular. It's been a popular series.
Yeah. It's always fun when people, the internet for you. That's the internet for you, right? When they come at you for this is not what I wanted.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, we don't read your minds, but we'll do our best.
Yeah. So it's as I say, it's been a popular series. So that was episode 1. We kind of did the overview and why are we doing this series and what's our motivation. The next episode we did an overview of Creation Week. So we looked at Creation Week as a whole week, how the days relate to one another. And then the third episode was an interesting one. We sort of did a bit of a detour and asked the hypothetical question, if we didn't have Genesis 1 in our Bibles, what could we still know from Scripture about creation? That was an interesting sort of detour. But
and we concluded that, we would lose a lot of detail, I think. But the general outline of recent creation thousands of years ago is still pretty much there outside of Genesis 1. Genesis
Yeah.
1, the days of creation are not some kind of linchpin or, the straw that breaks the camel's back or whatever. It's not
Yeah.
the most important thing in creation. And so
Yeah.
it's just one passage that works in with all the rest of them. Anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And then in the fourth episode in the series, we actually got down to the days of creation themselves at last. We looked at the days of creation in some detail. And then we had a bit of a hiatus where we didn't produce any episodes in the series. And then this summer we posted the fifth episode, and that looked at the doctrine of creation from nothing, creation ex nihilo. Why do Christians think that God made everything from nothing? Interestingly, that was actually the episode that got the least views, the least traction, even though that's actually quite a hot button topic, I think, in some theological circles. So it's interesting to see what sort of captures people's interest. But overall, it's been a really popular series. 4 of the 5 episodes have reached more than 900 views. The first has had more than 2,500 views on YouTube, which is pretty good, certainly for us. But of course, that brings us then to the next chapter, the one that we're about to sort of launch into, which is Genesis chapter 2. So, Todd, why don't you pick up the story from there?
Yeah. Yeah. But before I go, it does seem weird that this is only the 6th episode in the series. It feels like we've done a lot of these things. And apparently we haven't. It is only 6. So what are you going to do? All right. So the story as we move on. So let's make a bit more precision here about the division that we're talking about. We're not necessarily going to talk about all of chapter 2. The real transition between the days of creation and what comes after happens in verse 4 of chapter 2. So Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, they kind of complete the story of the first week, and they tell us about God instituting the first Sabbath. He rested from his work, and he blessed the Sabbath. He made it holy. And then there's this verse. This is Genesis 2:4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. So this verse contains that formula that is, these are the generations of, or this is the book of the generations. Um,
Mm.
and that forms a kind of framework for the entire book of Genesis. That Hebrew term there, the generations of, that's the word toledot. And it's
Hmm.
repeated multiple times. There's 10 more times that it shows up in the book of Genesis. And half of the times that it's used are right here in the first 11 chapters. So once you pick up
Mm.
with the story of Abraham and his descendants, the toledots become sparser. They become more spaced out.
Mm.
So I think this is kind of an important point to note. And I think other creationists would also agree with us on this point. Because this gives a kind of, what would you call it? A framework to the entire book, right?
Mm.
It's commonly kind of said that you have this division between Genesis 1 through 11, the primordial history, and 12 and the rest of the book after chapter 12, which is the patriarchal history, the history of early Israel. And with this, Toledot structure tying it all together, if you're going to go in for the historicity of the latter chapters of Genesis, which I think a lot of evangelical scholars would do, well, then you've got this connecting thread that goes all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Now, the Toledot here in 2:4, it's a weird transition. A lot of the Toledots
Mm.
seem like they're like headings for the next section. This could go either way. It's not really obvious that it goes one way or the other. Maybe we'll pick up on this in a future episode. Um, but yeah, it basically serves as the pivot point between the days of creation and the account of Adam and Eve and the garden and the fall and so forth.
Mm.
So the next big thing in chapter 2 then is the story of the creation of Adam, and then the planting of the garden, and then the naming of the animals, and then the creation of Eve. And for a long time, Christian scholars have argued that Genesis 2 elaborates or expands the details of the sixth day of creation that was described in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is kind of like an overview, a big summary. This is what happened during the creation week. There's a particular formula that the author follows, the evening and the morning, and God said, those kinds of repeated phrases give it kind of that rhythm.
Hmm.
But then um, when he gets the sixth day, he just follows the same structure. And then in chapter 2, he kind of rewinds to give us a more detailed look at the events that surrounded the creation of human beings.
Hmm.
And honestly, that sounds good to me, at least on first glance. But there have
Yeah.
been a lot of recently, let's put it that way, the past I don't know 200 years, there have been a lot of people who have suggested or outright insisted that Genesis 1 and 2 are really different and they don't really go together, and Genesis 2 is not an elaboration of of the sixth day of creation. So maybe you can tell us more about that, Paul.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, like you say, I mean that kind of sounds reasonable, but the devil's in the details, as they say. So,
Yeah.
um, modern critical scholarship tends to come to this passage, with a lot of skepticism. Um, Genesis 2, it is different in sort of focus style from chapter 1. Um, so, you can kind of understand why it sort of feels like something quite different, almost independent. And so the critical scholars, I think the view they take is that, what's happened here is the redactors, the latest sort of editors, as they see it, have taken two different stories and kind of meshed them together. And so they tend to focus on the differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, particularly the kind of differences of detail. And I think it might be helpful just to go through some of those differences so that we can talk about them in this episode. Um, so some of the points that the scholars make, well, the first one is that Genesis chapter 1 exclusively uses the Hebrew name for God, Elohim, whereas Genesis 2 uses a different name for God, Yahweh, the kind of covenant name for God that was given to Moses, revealed to Moses. And so they point out this difference, this different name for God in the two respective chapters. Also, there are other differences. Genesis 1 depicts God making everything in 6 days, whereas in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, we've got this statement that it was in the day that the heavens and the earth were made. So there seems to be a difference. Also, in Genesis 1, God simply speaks and things come into existence. Let there be, and it was so. Whereas in Genesis 2, we have, for example, God shaping Adam's body as he makes him from the dust, making Eve from Adam's side. So we have God apparently using pre-existing materials rather than just sort of speaking things ex nihilo into existence. Another difference is that there's no Garden of Eden. in Genesis chapter 1. There's no mention of the garden there at all. Whereas obviously in Genesis 2, that's the whole setting for the chapter, for the passage. So that's a significant difference. In Genesis chapter 1, we have this sort of reference to God creating humans male and female, making them male and female. Almost as if, they were kind of made male and female together. But of course, in Genesis 2, we have male and female not created at the same time. We have Adam formed first and then Eve from his side. Another difference in Genesis 1, when God made people, he tells them to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, to exercise dominion. But we don't see that in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2, we have a story of Adam being alone and being told when he was on his own to take care of the garden, not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Another difference in Genesis chapter 1, God makes plants 3 days before he makes humans. We have the sequence of events on the different days, and the plants are made 3 days earlier than man. But in Genesis 2, at least at first blush, as you sort of read the text, it sounds as if there were no plants growing when God planted the garden and placed Adam in the garden. And then one final difference is that in Genesis chapter 1, God made the animals on the last 2 days of creation, day 5, day 6. And then he makes human beings as sort of the culmination of his work of creation. Whereas in Genesis 2, we have this sort of narrative where God seems to make Adam on his own. He's alone. And then we recognize that it isn't good for, Adam recognizes it isn't good. Or rather, God recognizes it isn't good for Adam to be alone. And so God then makes the animals, and then he makes Eve and presents Eve to Adam. And so there seems, again, at first glance, to be a kind of different sequence of events compared to Genesis chapter 1. So, that's quite a long list. That's quite a list of things that people have often said are contradictory between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, and there are probably others that we haven't mentioned here. We've just sort of picked out the major ones that tend to get talked about. But this is a very popular subject because, if you Google contradictions between Genesis 1 and 2, you will come up with a whole plethora of web pages, websites, articles, people talking about this. People seem to be quite sort of obsessed with this idea that there are these significant contradictions between these two chapters. Everybody's got an opinion about it. So hopefully this is going to be a popular episode because it is something people seem to talk a lot about. So, Todd, what do you make of this list? Are we looking here at a whole list of contradictions in the very opening chapters of the Bible? How do you see this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're right. It is enormously popular. Getting ready for this episode, it's overwhelming trying to sort through all the different claims and so forth. So yeah, I'm hoping this one shoots way up there in the rankings and gets really popular. Okay, so what do I think about this? Well, first of all, I want to say that I don't think anybody in creationism, well, that's probably not true. There's probably some weirdo that's going to be real stubborn about this, but I think most of us would agree Genesis 2 really is pretty different from Genesis 1. It's different stories. There is a different focus. The pacing of the story is very different. The literary structure, and as you mentioned, the name for God, the vocabulary is different in the two accounts. So I agree. These are very different, unique sort of stories. And the question then I have is, all right, well, are these differences then actual contradictions, right? It's not enough to just be telling a different story, right? A contradiction has to be two explicit claims that are definitely not compatible. If I say I have a glass that's half full and you say I have a glass that's half empty, that's the same thing. Different way of saying it,
Yeah.
it's the same thing, right? And so that's the kind of thing we want to look out for here. It's not going to be enough to just describe things differently. We're looking for things where it can't be both right? That can't both be telling the same story. And what
Yeah.
I think, as I think back to, looking over this episode and researching all this stuff, it really feels like a lot of this comes down to the limitation of language. When someone is just telling you a story, your brain sometimes fills in details that they didn't actually say, right? That wasn't part of the story they were telling. But your brain has helpfully filled in a lot of details and you get things wrong. This is how we end up arguing with people. No, you said this. No, I didn't. I said this. It's kind of annoying. And so humanity is on full display here. Is Genesis 1 contradictory of Genesis 2?
Yeah.
Um, and so beware when people tell you it's obviously contradictory, because sometimes obvious things aren't quite as obvious as you think. So as we go through all of this stuff, we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep in mind, are we looking at a half full, half empty kind of a situation where we're describing kind of the same thing? Or maybe we're making a claim. Maybe I say my glass is half empty and you say you have an empty bucket.
Mhm.
Um, that could be a contradiction if, you were claiming that I only had an empty bucket and I was claiming that I only had, a half full cup. But if I had both, then we would both be right
Mhm.
still, even though it's
Yeah.
very different and sounds contradictory. So it's one of those things where we're just going to have to be really careful as we go through this, that we're not trying to make the text say things that it doesn't actually say. And we're going to have to be very careful to listen to exactly what the text says rather than what we think the text means.
Yeah.
So, what do you think, Paul? What do we say? Let's
Yeah.
start with this first one, this Elohim versus Yahweh or Jehovah.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, well,
Contradiction?
I think the point you've just made there, that difference is not necessarily contradiction, is a good one, and I think this is a case in point, isn't it? Um, we've said chapter 1 refers to God as Elohim. Chapter 2 uses this sort of personal covenant name for God, Yahweh. Um, but they're the same person. They both refer to God. They're just different names for the same person. For the same, for one God. It's not like there's one God who's called Elohim and another God who's called Yahweh. They're just two different names. So it's not a contradiction. It's an interesting difference. And we might sort of ask ourselves why. Why is one name used exclusively in one chapter and the other in the second chapter? But I think when we ask that question, there actually is a very reasonable answer in light of the different focus of the story, which we've already sort of touched on. So Genesis 1 gives us that big picture. It's talking about God as the creator of everything. It's showing his power over the whole of creation. Genesis 2 has a different focus. Genesis 2 is more personal. It's about God's relationship to human beings, to Adam and to Eve. So it seems reasonable to me. It seems obvious why these different names would be used, because the big story has that general name for God, Elohim. The more personal story has that personal name by which God has revealed himself and will reveal himself later to Moses, the name of Yahweh. So to me, I mean, this is a difference. It's a significant difference, but it doesn't look like a contradiction to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. So yeah, that's a classic. It's a very interesting difference, like you say, but I don't see how that's a contradiction. So we got eight things on our list here. That's one down. I don't think it's a real contradiction. The second
Sure.
one on our list was the difference in days, right? So
Mm.
Genesis 1 describes creation over the course of 6 days. And
Mm.
then Genesis 2, verse 3 says, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens.
Yeah.
And so the assumption there, I think, is that when it says in the day that God made the earth and the heavens, that the text is actually claiming that everything was created in a single day rather than in 6 days, over the course of 6 days. And I feel like this sort of hinges on this question of what does in the day mean, right?
Mm.
Now in English we have, we use the word back in my day, and we don't mean a single day. We might even talk about back in the olden days and use it plural, and that sort of is a little better in terms of precision, but we're still talking about, olden days is talking about a culture, it's talking about a memory, might not be talking about a specific set of days. Anyway, so the question is, in my mind, is that the kind of thing that we see in Hebrew? And when you look through the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, you find that in the day is used a lot, and it's often modified. It might be modified by a number, like in the fourth day, or in the sixth day, or in the 20th day, or whatever. And sometimes it's modified by a simple specifier, something like in the same day or in the very day. And those kinds of modifiers, the last ones there, the in the same day or in the very day, that really makes me think, yeah, if you have to specify, no, I mean an actual day, the actual literal day, then that suggests in the day has a bigger usage than just specifying a single, 24-hour period of time or a single period of light. That it actually has a broader meaning than that. So that tells me this is kind of a weak contradiction, because it could just mean, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, something like that, some non-specific
Yeah.
statement like that. And it's not intended to be in the very day or in the same day or in that exact day. So I don't feel like that really rises to the level of contradiction, mostly because there's a lot of ambiguity in the way it's phrased. So that's two down. I
Yeah.
don't think that's a real contradiction.
Yeah. I think you're right. In the day seems to me to be a kind of Hebrew idiom that just means when.
Yeah.
And it's actually translated that way, isn't it? I think the NIV translates it as when. Um, so yeah, I don't see that as a uh, big sort of point of contradiction. Well, that's two of our 8 contradictions that aren't really contradictions. Let's have a look at the third one. So the third on the list was this difference between God simply speaking something into existence and the way that in chapter 2 God shapes Adam's body and he makes Eve from Adam's side. Now, here I think we just need to kind of go back to the text. And as you say, let's be careful to look at what the text says. And in Genesis 1, in verse 26, we have these words. Then God said, let us make man in our image. And then verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And one of the things that you'll notice, I think, there as we read those verses is that we don't really have any detail about how God created us. It's just a simple statement that he created male and female. Um, i- It's different from previous examples that we've seen where God speaks something into existence, let there be, and it was so. It's different to that. Um, so, how should we read this? How should we read verse 27? Is it excluding the possibility of God shaping a body from dust? Uh, um, I don't think it is. I don't think that would be a fair assumption to make on the basis of this verse. I just don't think it's giving us enough detail to really think about about the mechanism. What is the actual mechanism that God used to create? It simply is telling us that God created man. And I think what Genesis 2 does is it then elaborates on the claim that's there in Genesis chapter 1 and fills in the details about how exactly that happened. But I don't see any contradiction here. It's just a summary of what Genesis 2 explains in more detail.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. That's one that I've never quite understood. It felt like really you have to read into
Yeah.
chapter 1 something that chapter 1 isn't actually saying. All right, well,
Yeah.
so far, our contradictions aren't holding up very well under scrutiny here.
No.
Obviously, that's designed, but anyway, that's 3 of our 8 that we have been able to deal with. And again, they're all genuine differences. There's no question that Genesis 2 is telling a very different sort of story than what you find in Genesis 1. But I'm still trying to see where they are contradictory. All right, so next on the list, the Garden of Eden. I don't really think there's a lot to say about this one. It's not in Genesis 1. It's kind of the setting of the story of Genesis 2 and 3. It's where, there's the whole planting of Eden in Genesis 2, which is a pretty long section, and then there's Adam and Eve in the garden, and then there's the temptation and the fall, and then they get expelled. So it's a major part of the story of 2 and 3.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know what to say about this one. Omitting some detail from a story is not the same as denying that detail took place. It's a really interesting difference. But then again, Genesis 1 is really giving us that big overview and kind of ends when, human beings are created. Then God takes his rest on the Sabbath, and then that's it. That's the end of the story, sort of. And Eden isn't, if Eden's not made until Adam is made, then clearly we've got, the stories of 2 and 3 are happening kind of after-ish. There's a little bit of overlap with the 6th day, but otherwise it's kind of happening after the stuff that happened in Genesis 1. So I just don't see I don't see how that's a contradiction. It's an omission, sure, but it doesn't make a contradiction.
Yeah. No, I agree. So we're about halfway through. So far, I don't think we've really come up with a good example of a contradiction. The 5th alleged contradiction relates to the timing of God's creation of the woman. We've already said in Genesis 1, it sort of sounds like they're made at the same time. God created them male and female. But then in Genesis 2, we read that Adam is formed first and then Eve is made later. But again, I mean, are we guilty of trying to read too much into what Genesis 1 is saying? Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." I mean, to me, that's just a summary. It's not telling us anything about mechanism and timing, as I've already said. It just isn't that clear. It just isn't that specific. So, if we read this as a summary statement, and then Genesis 2 is kind of filling in the details of actually how that transpired, again, there's no contradiction here. And I don't see anything in the text that kind of compels me to think this is anything other than a summary statement.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I feel like the main time sequence in Genesis 1 are those days, and
Yeah.
it reads like a simple summary as you go through. Um, God created flyers and swimmers on day 5. Well, which one came first? And, what order did they go in? Did they just all appear at the same time? Those kinds of questions just aren't in the
Yeah.
interest of the author at all. Um,
Yeah.
so here, I just feel like you're right on the money. There's really nothing in that statement that would make me think there's got to be some kind of sequence going on or not going on.
Yeah.
All right, so next, what did God tell the man and the woman when he created them? So, did he tell them to be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion? Or did he tell Adam that he could eat of any tree in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Or could he have done both?
Hmm.
Is this really a contradiction, right? So, so remember that in Genesis 1, the blessing there is given to the man and the woman together, right? Obviously, obviously, be fruitful and multiply. That's not a solo task there. That's not something Adam's going to do by himself. So it not just the context of male and female have been created, but the very content of the command is obviously for
Yeah.
man and woman. Um, But then in chapter 2, when God creates Eve and presents Eve to Adam, the focus is entirely on Adam and his reaction to Eve. So once again, there's a personal story being told here about Adam and his creation and Eve and her creation. That is sort of superseding the details of the first chapter. And you can imagine an author writing this, saying, I'm going to tell the details of the sixth day, and thinking to himself, I don't need to repeat, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, because I covered that in Genesis 1.
Yeah.
So is it a contradiction? I don't know. I don't know that either chapter gives us enough detail to know exactly the sequence of what's going on here, how it works. And so, in my mind, I chalk this up to this is a difference. The
Mm.
universal perspective, the godlike perspective of chapter 1, where it's God creating everything, and then everything is moving towards the Sabbath, right? You don't want to drag the story down with the Garden of Eden and the prohibition against the tree of knowledge, of good and evil, because you're driving toward the Sabbath. And so it makes sense to me that certain things would be omitted in Genesis 1, certain things would be omitted in Genesis 2, and when you put them together, you get the full story. But that doesn't make it contradictory, I don't think. Just
Yeah.
different emphases.
Yeah. Ma- Makes them complementary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So where have we got to? 6 down. 2 more to go. Now, this next one, I think is actually one of the more interesting ones, and it concerns the origin of plants.
Mhm.
So you'll remember we've already said in Genesis 1, we have the sequence of the days of creation, and we have God creating the plants on day 3, along with the dry land. 3 days before he creates man on the 6th day. In Genesis 2, we read this in verse 5. When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. And then it goes on to say, God made Adam, and he planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. That's verses 8 and 9. Now, on face value, that sounds very different from Genesis chapter 1. Um, because in the sequence of days in Genesis 1, the text really does seem to say that God made the plants on day 3 before the humans on day 6. But then we get to Genesis 2, and we're told there are no plants of the field before God makes Adam. And then after he creates Adam, he makes the fruit trees grow. So, I mean, that sounds more like a contradiction. In Genesis 1, we've got the plants created before Adam. Genesis 2, we've got the plants made after Adam. Now, the question is this really a contradiction? And again, we have to look carefully at what the text actually says and what it doesn't say. Notice in Genesis chapter 1, in verse 11, the plants that God creates on the third day of creation, they're described as vegetation, plants yielding seed, and trees bearing fruit. But when we come to Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, we read there the description of the plants as the bush of the field and the plant of the field. It's interesting. There's that addition of the field. Now, the question is that an important difference? I mean, it seems that it might be significant. So the question, I guess, is Genesis 2 wanting us to understand that the land was completely barren, with no plants at all, or is it trying to describe something else by giving us that little clue of the field, So come back to the text again. Why are there no plants of the field in Genesis 2? Well, the answer is because there was no man to work the ground, to till the ground. And then when God makes Adam, he immediately sort of plants this garden for him, the Garden of Eden, a garden where cultivated plants can grow. And so I think the question that kind of comes up in our minds is when God makes the fruit trees grow there in the garden, is that the absolute origin of fruit trees? Or is this related specifically to the planting of the garden? Is this somehow related more specifically to Eden? So how should we read this passage? Are we in Genesis 2, are we talking about the absolute origin of plants, the creation of plants, or are we talking about something more specific? Are we talking about the origin of agriculture, of horticulture, of farming? Is there something else going on? And so again, to me, as I read this, particularly when I see those qualifiers, the bush of the field, the plant of the field, there's a question that just arises: is this really a contradiction? Because I mean, I can see how somebody might read it as a contradiction, particularly if you're not paying very close attention to the text. But when you begin to see that the language used is actually somewhat modified, somewhat qualified, I just wonder whether something more is going on here than might at first meet the eye.
Yeah, I think that is all very fair. I think both the idea that this could be a contradiction, yeah, that is a puzzle. There's definitely something weird happening here. Um, but I do think, as you say, there's a whole emphasis on agriculture. The whole idea that
Yeah.
it doesn't rain because there was no man to till the ground, right? Right
Yeah.
there's another clue about agriculture. There's
Yeah.
this agricultural focus there that's quite different from sort of the first chapter. All right,
Yeah.
well, don't need to rehearse that. I agree with you. Good stuff. It's
Mhm.
kind of ambiguous, but I could definitely see how you might think that would be a contradiction. Surely better than, say, the difference in, Yahweh and Elohim between the two chapters.
Yeah.
So
But for me, I mean, that context of the planting of the garden, that's significant.
yeah, absolutely.
That is definitely significant.
Yeah, definitely,
But
definitely. And it definitely
we
leaves me thinking, well, this could very well just be
yeah,
talking about the origin of agriculture and the planting of the garden and not really talking about the original creation of plants from nothing.
yeah,
All right,
yeah,
so that leaves me with the final one.
yeah,
And from my perspective, we've moved through the easy ones, knocked down all the little straw men, and now we've got the really hard ones. So the plants
yeah,
were the first hard one. This one's the
yeah.
second hard one. This is the animal creation.
Mm,
Um, so God made Adam, right? And God plants a garden. God puts him in the garden, and he decides it's not good for Adam to be alone. And then we read this here in the KJV, and out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. Now, that is going to be, with plants, you can sort of get away with, well, maybe he's making things grow where they weren't growing before. And so he's making a garden that didn't exist before. That seems quite plausible. This is very explicit, right?
mm,
You've got God creating things right out of the dust of the ground. This is not God, hey, let's round up some creatures and bring them to Adam. God makes these right out of the ground. Um, and that sequence is definitely not what Genesis 1 describes. In Genesis 1, you have the birds in particular being created on the fifth day, and then the land animals on the sixth day, and then human
mm,
beings appear in a creation that already has these things.
yeah,
So have we finally come to a contradiction? Is this it? Have we found one?
yeah. Well, I think um, I've got some questions about this before everybody gets too excited
Sure.
that we finally come up with a contradiction. So, one of the questions I have is that just as we saw with the plants, where there's this qualifier of the field, I kind of see something similar here. We have beasts of the field. So, I mean, do you think that changes our understanding of the creation of animals um, in Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2 in any way?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Genesis 1 describes the creation of animals in verse 24. It says
Mm,
cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth. And in Hebrew, you're right. The beasts of the earth is not the same as beasts of the field. And more importantly, as you mentioned, the of the field here describing the animals is exactly the same of the field that's used to describe the
right.
plants. So there is a connection here, I think. If we're going to say the plants of the field are sort of agricultural, it suggests here that the animals created are also the kinds of animals that would be involved with human agriculture because they're both
Mm,
of the field.
yeah.
Okay, so I still have questions, right? Because even if we accept that the beasts of the earth in Genesis 1 aren't quite the exact same beasts as the beasts of the field in Genesis 2, does the description of the sixth day in Genesis 1 really allow for the creation of any animals after the creation of people?
Mm,
I don't know. So if we accept Genesis 1, the rhythm of the days, right, as the actual sequence of events, then it really does seem like the beasts of the field are kind of out of order. But even more importantly, the
mm,
birds of the air. So the birds of the
right.
air, that's the same phrase used in Genesis 1. It's exactly the same combo, birds of the air. Um,
Yeah.
and we know they're on Genesis on day 5 in Genesis 1. So that is clearly the sequence of events. The days are creating this sequence of events. And so if birds of the air, same words in Genesis 2 and Genesis 1. So there really isn't any textual anything here to suggest that something is funny.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the same thing. And in Genesis
Yeah.
1, they're birds of the air created the day before humans, and here in Genesis 2, the birds are created after Adam but before Eve. So
Yeah.
that is definitely not the same. Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. So, we've worked through our list. We've got to number 8. Have we finally found a contradiction, or
huh.
is there some other possible interpretation of this passage that actually explains what's going on here?
Well, here's one possibility, and it's a technical possibility. And I'm going to relate only what I've learned from Hebrew scholars, because, as you know, Paul, I myself am not a Hebrew scholar, so I'm just gonna have to repeat what I've heard. So I've come to understand that the Hebrew language here lacks the past perfect verb tense. Now, I'm sure that triggered flashbacks to your days in grammar school. Oh no, not that again. Pluperfects and all that other stuff, and gerunds and weird words that you'll never use again. You know what? In my entire adult life, no one has ever asked me to diagram a sentence, but here we are. So let me see if I can boil this down pretty simply. Right. So if I said to you today, I got up early, I came to the cabin here where I record, I brought a new microphone, and I set up for recording this episode. You would probably understand that's a sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, those events. I got up, I came, I set up, so forth. But if I said this, today I got up early, I came to the cabin, I had brought a new microphone,
Mm.
and I set it up for podcasting. Well, that little had there changes the sequence somewhat, right?
Yeah.
Because now it sounds like I'm saying I had already done that before the other two events that I described in the earlier sequence. So it's a way for you to create a linguistic sequence that is not necessarily a sequence of events.
Yeah.
So that's what it is to be past tense versus perfect, past perfect tense. So the past perfect means it's something I already done. Past means I did it in the past. Now, Hebrew does not have a past perfect tense. But, reading your Bible, there are places where the past perfect is implied. And it's implied by the context that's based on the Hebrew perfect tense. Perfect tense means that an action has been completed. But it's not necessarily past tense or past perfect. Could be either one. So it could be here that verse 19 of Genesis 2 should actually read, "Now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens." That is a possible way of reading it because of the weird tenses in Hebrew. So maybe the context of Genesis 1 is actually the context that's supposed to tell us, hey, read this thing as a past perfect rather than as a past tense, or,
Yeah.
as an action that's been completed in the sequence there. And that rendering the Lord God had formed is exactly how the English Standard Version translates this passage. So that seems awful technical to me, but I mean, if that is how the Hebrew language works, then it certainly does make that verse quite ambiguous. Is it actually
Yeah.
saying that there is a sequence wherein God made animals after he made Adam, or is it a past perfect, which Hebrew doesn't have, indicating that God had already done this, and he just brought them to Adam to name. And
Hmm.
if that's a real ambiguity, if that's how Hebrew actually works, then it seems like it's kind of unfair to insist that there must be a contradiction. It's just not clear. Maybe it is,
Yeah.
maybe it's not.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe, that's good enough for us, right? So we've done,
Yeah.
all these contradictions. This one's really interesting, I agree. But it does turn out to be kind of ambiguous in the end. And maybe that's just where we're going to have to leave it.
Yeah.
It's not obviously a contradiction.
I think that grammatical point is a really interesting one. And it seems to me that there's a whole lot of research that a Hebrew scholar uh, could do in this area. I mean, it'd be really interesting to see how commentators down through the ages
Hmm.
have understood this passage, including early commentators who perhaps were closer to the context or closer to the language than we are. So yeah, anyway, there's a lot of work that can be done there. It's a really interesting point. Um, and context is, as you say, everything. There's also a larger context here, which I think we have to sort of take into account, which is that, we've already said that, Genesis 1 and 2 have got these very different sort of emphases and styles. Um, Many of the things that, get raised as contradictions, we've already been through them and found that often there's a very reasonable explanation given the very different um, styles of these two respective passages. And so, if we've been through a whole list of potential contradictions and found that they have a reasonable explanation, it kind of um, gives me the sense that we should probably give the benefit of the doubt to this being another one of those differences, not contradictions. Um, we should at least, I think, be open to that possibility because everything else that we've looked at has turned out not really to be, to be contradictory. The author has just got different motives, for telling the story in different ways in these two passages. And yeah, I think we've just got to always keep that in mind and be generous to the author, um, given the track record that we've just looked at.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's a really really important point that after going through all of these differences and finding them mostly differences and not necessarily contradictions, we really ought to give the benefit of the doubt, as you say. Um,
Yeah.
Maybe this is just one more of those differences. Now let's do a little a mental exercise here. Let's pretend that the critical scholars are in fact correct that these are two completely contradictory stories that have been patched together and that they were never supposed to be, you know, the same story to begin with. And here's my question about that, and it's kind of an important one. Why didn't they fix the contradictions?
Right.
Um, so the critical model is you have two stories that are completely separate and different, and they've been put together, and the differences have been smoothed over. There have been editing, redactors, all this stuff over the hundreds of years since it was originally composed and so forth. And so these guys that are copying and editing these texts, they don't seem to be shy about changing things. So if these two stories were as wildly contradictory as we're led to believe, why didn't the editors fix it? Why didn't they
Yeah.
make it more sensible?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
maybe these just aren't very good contradictions in the first place. And maybe the ancients just read this and said, yeah, this obviously goes together just fine, and there's no
Yeah.
need to fix it. Now,
Yeah.
I don't, I don't claim to know exactly how Genesis was put together or composed. I tend to follow the traditional model that Moses would be the author of these texts, um, the originator of the texts. I'm not sure that that implies that Moses has to originate the stories themselves, right? He's not making this stuff up, I don't think. So is it possible that Moses used sources to put together Genesis? Sure. Is he dumb enough to put things together that contradict each other and not make them not contradictory? I don't know. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think the story that critical scholars are trying to tell me is just problematic. I can't
Nope.
wrap my head around it.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that's a very good point, and that's probably a good place to kind of wrap up. To sort of summarize, we're acknowledging that these are very different passages, Genesis 1 and 2. We've looked at a whole load of alleged contradictions. I think all of the major ones that tend to get talked about. But we've seen that most of them just reduce to differences that are not really contradictions. Where the wording is sometimes taken to be contradictory, it's mostly just because the language is a bit ambiguous and unclear. It just doesn't really say what people are reading into it. There was really, I mean, when it comes down to it, there were only two sort of harder cases, which were the plants and the animals and the sequence of events. But even there, even with the hardest, which was the animals, a better understanding of Hebrew verb tenses might kind of be the solution to the whole thing. So, and as you say, even if we accept the critical scholars' sort of viewpoint, it doesn't really make much sense, because why would they not just have edited out these contradictions and kind of made the whole thing sort of flow in a more sensible way? So I think that's been a useful exercise to go through all of those differences before we actually begin to get down to Genesis 2 itself, because we haven't really looked at what happens in Genesis 2. We've talked all about the timing and sequence of events and potential sort of contradictions. We haven't actually looked at what Genesis 2 says. So we will come back to that in a future 101 episode. But any final thoughts, Todd, as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's funny that we've had this whole episode that is just about nitpicky little details that really don't have much to do with what's actually the message of Genesis 2. So we are definitely going to come back to that in the future. And yeah, I think you've wrapped it up pretty well. I just can't wrap my head around the critical model of how this passage was composed. And I tend to think that most of these wild contradictions are just wild exaggerations. There's certainly weird differences, but I'm not sure I would conclude that that's a contradiction. And that's that. So what's next on Let's Talk Creation? I don't know. We're going to find out in 2 weeks when you come back, and hope you'll join us then. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell, all that good stuff. Thanks for your support. And we look forward, based on the topic of this episode, to all of your hate mail and comments in the YouTube comment section. Be sure to get into a pointless argument with a perfect stranger, because that's what the internet is for, right? All right. Well, thanks, everybody, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
We'll see you then. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.